Now we're about to dig into a really interesting conversation. My next guest is Neil Howe. He's the author and managing director. He's an author and a managing director of Demography at Hedgeye. And he says that a secession crisis in the United States, I want to repeat that, a secession crisis in the United States is a possibility. So Neil, your book, The Fourth Turning, is about generational crises and the ensuing shifts that result. You say that we're in the middle of one right now. I'm hoping you can tell us about how a secession crisis fits in here.
Well, just to set the stage, we look at these periods of civic renewals, or these great periods of creative destruction in our civic, economic, and political life occur about once every long human lifetime, about 80 or 90 years. This is about the fifth time we're at it, right? And I think one of the things that's really on the table now is regional. We look at the growing regional bifurcation of America. It's interesting, you go back and you look at Bill Clinton back in 1992, he won the presidency by about 6 percentage points of the popular vote. He had only almost half of all America's counties, about 1,500 counties out of 3,000. Take a look at Joe Biden here in 2020. We expect him to be up around 4.5% of the popular vote, not quite at Clinton's level, but he may have only 550 counties, right? All the others are red zones. So basically what you're seeing is the rural deconcentration becoming ever more landslide counties for red zone candidates, and all of these urban areas becoming increasingly landslide, right, for blue zone candidates. And ultimately it creates a situation, either the red zone or the blue zone. I think it's probably more realistically going to occur with the red zone being either nullifying or seceding. Nullifying is when you simply say, this regulation or tax doesn't apply here. I dare you to do something about it. And seceding is when you eventually say, let's just cut the formalities. We'll go our own way. And that creates a moment at which, of course, the other side may not be able to back down. They have to do something about it, right? And this is, needless to say, if you want to talk about creative destruction, I think that gets you instantly into that kind of scenario.
Right. So you're saying that the South might try to secede again. Of course, we saw this with the American Civil War. I know you're kind of hinting at it, but what do you think might be the catalyst for something like that, if we have not yet seen it?
It could range the gamut. I mean, it could be economic, it could be a tax, it could be social regulation, it could be anything. We've seen, by the way, and it's not just one-sided. We've had over the history of our country, we have people on all sides have tried to secede. We had the nullification resolutions by Jefferson and Madison. Back in the 1790s, we had the Hartford Convention by the Federalists. We've had all kind of secessionist movements by different sides. The most momentous one, you're absolutely right, was when the South en bloc seceded over slavery. But this hasn't been entirely resolved, and we may see a different geographical configuration. As you know, we've had talked about scenarios about blue zone secessions, right? California and Oregon, the West Coast seceding, over sanctuary states, sanctuary cities, and so on. But I think it's a sign of tremendous stress. Two sides that don't trust each other, embrace kind of irreconcilable worldviews about where the country's heading. And I think it's related to other stressors. I mean, I'm not focusing purely on secession. I look at economic events to retip the economic playing field, like inflation. Modern monetary theory would be a good example, or foreign conflict. I mean, these are very often fourth turning developments that become much more likely in this kind of period when people are looking for some way in which to mobilize and galvanize unity and public support.
So I want to ask you now, because we're in the middle of this fourth turning, but we also are in the middle of a pandemic. And you had mentioned in an interview that socialism is no longer a Bernie bro fantasy. As we see Americans increasingly reliant on assistance from the government because of the pandemic, and even asking for more assistance in the form of another stimulus package, wondering how you see the country at least shifting on that point, especially as we move to a post-pandemic world.
Yes, I think we're absolutely seeing it. Look, this past year, both wage earners and businesses were all on the dole. Let's face it. And I think now we're simply managing that reality in the same way in which the Fed has promised to keep the yield curve flat on the floor for the next 2 years. I think the idea, this is where I get into modern monetary theory, but the whole world is beginning to embrace it. Real interest rates, even long-term real interest rates, are negative. Well, you'd be stupid not to borrow and give it to people who need it in that kind of environment, right? And if it doesn't cause inflation, great. If it does, that might actually solve some of our problems, right? You take resources away from creditors, give it to debtors. Then it might actually be a feature, not a bug. So I think that this is the new world we're coming into. People are beginning to realize we need radical solutions to break out of the box we're in. And interestingly, I think these are being embraced by both sides, kind of in their own way. That's what makes it kind of scary.
I'm wondering, as we see the election results and we have a president who continues to undermine them and continues to file lawsuits, and again, as we are in the middle of this, period of upheaval, that you're talking about, are you optimistic for our democracy as it stands right now in the long term?
We've had periods in our history. The Civil War is a great example. President Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. As many of we know, he put, I think, half of the Maryland legislature in jail at one point. I mean, we have these periods. The 1930s and World War II was not a great time for necessarily process, right? But we come out of them stronger on the other side. There's a great report just put out by the Cambridge Center on Democracy by Roberta Foa on declining confidence in democracy by millennials worldwide. Basically throughout the West, all the English-speaking world, all of Europe, and much of South and East Asia. And basically what they're showing is that young people want less participation and process when it doesn't actually yield results. And you see younger generations now much less necessarily dedicated to due process for everyone. What they want is results. There's certainly an impatience, a lack of respect for the liberal due process, which always seems to end up protecting older, wealthier people's rights to keep what they have, as opposed to something which actually looks toward the future and reallocates resources accordingly. But this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. And by the way, interestingly, it's not left wing versus right wing. One of the very interesting aspects of this study, which uses polls from all over the world, so both left and right populism is galvanizing younger people.
Right. So older folks against younger folks, it seems. All right. We will leave that there. Neil Howe, author of The Fourth Turning and managing director of Demography at Hedgeye. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kristin.